everyone and welcome to 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪. In this video, I'll explain the 4th chapter of Class 11th Political Science, and the chapter that we have got for this video is Executive. Now, executive. As we know, legislature, judiciary and the executive form the three organs of the government, and the constitution ensures that there is coordination and balance that is maintained among these three, because they are necessary for the welfare of the people and maintaining law and order in a country. You do know that there are three organs of government and they work for the people, but in this chapter we'll discuss one of these three organs, that is the executive, and we'll see the function, structure and the composition of the executive. So it becomes very important to read this chapter, study this chapter very carefully, because after reading this chapter you would get some answers of some questions, such as the distinction between the parliamentary system and the presidential system of executive. Then what is the role of president according to the constitution, the constitutional position of the president in India, of course. Then we have the importance of Council of Ministers and the Prime Minister, and lastly, what is the importance of the administrative machinery, that is the bureaucracy. So we'll be discussing these points in this chapter, and of course the main agenda will be of executive, like how they do differ. Like there are various types of executives in different countries. We see a lot of various kind of designations in different countries, and their roles are also very different. Like their powers are different, their functions are different, their composition is different. That is because there are different types of executive. So we'll try to understand different types of executive, what is executive in a broad manner, and its different composition. So without any further ado, let's get started with the first topic, that is, what is an executive? So what is an executive? Now you do know that executive are not just in government. Like you might have seen CEOs, that is Chief Executive Officers, some big companies like Google, Microsoft or any company. You do know that there are lot of executives in any formal organizations. Now for running any organization, what is important? We do know that in a formal organization there are some office holders who make laws, who supervise laws, like who are responsible for making decisions for the company or for the organization. But there are some office holders who implement those decisions or laws in the day-to-day functioning of the organization, and they are the executives of that organization. Literally, the term executive means a body of people responsible for the implementation of any rules, regulations or laws it could be. So we can say that it applies the same to the government also. In government too, we have the legislature, which is responsible for making laws and decisions for the country, and executive is a branch of government which does the function of implementation and functioning of all those decisions into day-to-day life of the people of legislature. Like you do know that those laws are made by legislature, so the laws made by the legislature are implemented by the executive, and we have different designations like the president, prime ministers or the bureaucracy in our country as the executives. You know that there are two types of executive. First is political executive, second is permanent executive. Well, the political executive includes all those ministers, the prime minister, presidents and council of ministers, which are in a government manner, which are elected, and they are all on an overall society basis, that they make laws, they are responsible for the framing of decisions, and they are supervising the implementation. But the actual day-to-day work is done by some bureaucrats, that is the administrative machinery, and they are known as, like you know, as civil servants. So they are the permanent executive, which literally implement those laws made by legislature into the day-to-day life of the people, and they are on a permanent basis because they are not elected by the people. So we'll discuss about them later as well, but now let's say that there are two types of executives. So executive has a lot of functions in our country. You know what, that we have a lot of branches in our country of the executive. They are in different designations, they could be in different places with different functions as well, but the overall agenda of the executive is to implement all those laws made by the legislature, like you know that legislature bodies of the parliament in the central level. So the main work or the function of the executive is to implement all those laws made by the legislature to all the country people, and that is the executive. Now second thing that comes up is, what are the different types of executive? So what are the different types of executive? Now you may have heard about the president of the US and the president of India, but are they really same? Aren't there any difference between their powers? Of course there are. Similarly, the King of England, the powers of King of England, or now at present time there is a king. So the King of England and the King of Bhutan have different powers, but still they are in the same position, that is the king of a country, but they share different powers. How is it possible? That is because they follow different procedures, they follow different type of executive in their countries. Let's try to understand this with some examples. First is, in Russia, we have semi-presidential system where there is both prime minister and the president, and they share some powers, equally powers, where the president is appointing the prime minister but cannot dismiss them. Where in UK, in Italy and Germany and Japan, we have the parliamentary system. In Japan, we have the parliamentary system of executive with constitutional monarchy, where there is a monarch or the king of that country. In Italy too, we have the parliamentary system of executive, where there is a prime minister as the head of government and president as the head of the state. In Canada too, we have the parliamentary system, where there is a monarch with constitutional monarchy as we have. So there is a monarch as the head of the state and a prime minister as the head of the government. Similarly, it follows in India as well. Talking about the third type of executive, that is a presidential system. It is followed in the US, where there is the president who holds all the power, like who is the head of the state as well as the head of the government, and is holding all the powers, is directly elected by the people. Now let us try to understand this. Like there are three types of executives, and they can be categorized into two types actually. That is, first could be that where the responsibility is on a collective belonging. That is, a group of individuals are there responsible. The powers are not just within an individual but with a group of individuals. Second could be where there is power only within individual. Now there are three types of executive. The first two could be in the first type of executive, that is where there is collective belonging, and these two are semi-presidential and parliamentary system or executive. Then for the second one, where the power all holds within a person, there is one classification, that is the presidential system. Now you know what, that between parliamentary system and presidential system there is a great difference, because in parliamentary system we have the prime minister as the head of the government and president, or it could be like any monarch as well, that is the, you could say, the head of the state. But in the presidential system, we have the president as the head of the state as well as the head of the government. Similarly, between parliamentary system and semi-presidential system, what is the difference? Because in both countries, we have the president and prime ministers. In both countries, we have the president as the head of the state and prime ministers as the head of the government. So what is the difference between semi-presidential system and the parliamentary system? Well, the major difference between these two is that in parliamentary system, the role of the president or the monarch is merely like a ceremonial head or the nominal head of the country. But in the semi-presidential system, we have the president as well as prime ministers who hold the power, day-to-day powers of the people. Like the president also in the semi-presidential system has the power of day-to-day functioning of the government. So even if he is the head of the state, he or she is not just a merely ceremonial head or the nominal head, like symbol of the country, because that president has the power, day-to-day functioning power of that country. So that would be a major difference between semi-presidential system and the parliamentary system. Parliamentary system is followed in countries like Japan, Italy, Germany, UK, as well as Portugal. The presidential system is followed in Brazil and most of the countries of Latin America. The semi-presidential system is followed in countries such as Russia and France. So in these countries we have semi-presidential system. So we can say that on a broad manner there are three types of executives. First one is the presidential executive, second is semi-presidential executive, and third is parliamentary executive. And these three can be divided into two groups, where there is collective belonging, that is, people are responsible, like not just an individual is responsible, power is within a group of individuals, because we have the president and the prime ministers, and there are council of ministers as well. But in the presidential system, the president is holding all the power and is not responsible, is not accountable to the legislature, whereas in the presidential or semi-presidential system and the parliamentary system, the president and the prime minister is accountable to the legislature. That is not the case with the presidential system. So that could be the different classifications of different types of executives. Now the third point comes here, that is parliamentary executive in India. So parliamentary executive in India, you know what, that the Indian constitution makers have adopted a parliamentary executive in India. The major question is, why did they do so? Like, was there really a need? Did they really need to do so, or was there any other alternative as well? Like even before the independence, our Indian leaders had a very great experience in parliamentary executive with the introduction of Government Indian Acts of 1919 and 1935, and that is why it was good thing. Then secondly, Indian constitution makers wanted a system where the people's expectation could be held by the government and not all the power is within just a person, because there could be some personality cults as well. That is why we adopted, like the constitution makers adopted the parliamentary system, because in parliamentary system you have not just one person as the president who is holding all the power. There are council of ministers, there is the president and the prime minister as well. Like, you know what, that president is the head of the state, but the effective power is within the prime minister and the council of ministers. Then if it was a presidential system, the other alternative at that time, then what would happen, that there would be only one person holding all the power, like the president, who would not be accountable to the legislature. So if there was any personality cults, that would stop the expectations of the people, that would reduce the expectations of the people. That is why, to hold the expectations of the people, to work for the welfare of the people, the constitution makers adopted the parliamentary system. Then there was also one thing, that they wanted to create a system where that executive would have a lot of power but would be bound by the expectations of people, by the people. It would not be that executive would overpower the people, because people should be one that controlling them, and that is by the representatives. So we see that in India we have executive and legislature, and they are interdependent. That means legislature controls executive and in turn is controlled by the executive. So that is kind of cycle that is being made in our country, and hence we adopted the parliamentary system by our constitution. In India we have the president as the head of the state and the prime minister as the head of the government, because even in parliamentary system we have two types of system. First is republic and second is constitutional monarchy. In republic you have the head of the state elected by the people, that is the president, even though he is indirectly elected by the people. And secondly, we have the constitutional monarchy, where the head of the state is a monarch that is not elected by the people, either directly or indirectly. So in India we have the republic type of parliamentary executive, and it was adopted by the constitution makers and has been mentioned in our constitution as well. Now the next topic that comes here is power and position of president. So power and position of president. Now it becomes very important that what role does the president play in our country, because he or she is the head of the state and is the formal representative of the country. Like he or she is seen as the head of the state, ceremonial head of the state, and is the overall representative symbol of the country. Now according to Article 74 Clause 1, there shall be a council of ministers with Prime Minister at the head to aid and advise the president, who shall in exercise of his functions act in accordance with such advice, provided that the president may require the council of ministers to reconsider that advice and shall act in tenderness of such reconsideration of advice. That means that there shall be a council of ministers. There would be a council of ministers to aid and advise the president. Now the word that becomes very important in this article is the uses of shall. You know what, that when you go in higher studies and you would see that if you opt for this subject, that there has been a very long debate in articles of the constitution related to these small words, because shall means a very binding term for the president. Shall here means that it is binding on the president, that there has to be a council of ministers. There is not any other alternative. There is not should or may, but it is shall. That means it is binding on the president and that can't be changed. So we can say that there is a council of ministers whose head is the prime minister, and they would advise the president. Like president acting as a formal head of the state has many powers, judiciary powers and like legislature powers, executive powers and emergency powers as well. But overall that powers are used by him only when advised by the council of ministers. That means that a very few discretionary powers are within the hands of the president, and what those are we will discuss later in this chapter as well. As you know that the president is indirectly elected by the people, and we have studied already it in the last chapter about the election of the president. That is, it is in the form of PR system, a proportional representative with a single transferable vote. So we can say that indirectly elected by the people, he or she is and acts as a former head of the state with a lot of power, but is advised by the council of ministers whose head is the prime minister. So we can say that there should be some work given to him as well, like there should be some powers given to him as well. So what are those powers we will discuss with the next topic, that is discretionary powers of the president. So discretionary powers of the president. Now let us talk about some of the powers of the president that would be used by him in his or her own discretion, like in his or her own consciousness, and those are, first of all, that is the veto power. You know what, that if any bill has been given, like before becoming a bill, before becoming a law, a bill has to be passed by the president as well. Now first case could be that, first uses of power by the president could be that he would ask the council of ministers to reconsider such an advice or such a law, such a bill. But if that person, if the council of ministers is reconsidering, even after reconsideration has not changed a single letter on that bill and has given it to the president, then president is bound to sign off that agreement or sign off that, pass that bill. So that means that first power could be sending back that bill to the council of ministers. However, this is limited because that if even after reconsideration there has not been a single change and is sent to the president, then president can't do a thing about it. Second one is the veto power. Now in veto power, what happens, that president has the power. First one was the advice. Second one could be if a bill before becoming a law is passed to the president and is sent back for reconsideration and is again sent to the president by the council of ministers without any change, then president can't do anything about that. But in this veto power, there has not been a mention of time limit. So it could be in the sense that the president has seen the bill and is not sending back that bill to the council of ministers and is not even passing that bill. So that would be within him and there is no time limit. So of even for 1 year, 2 years, or maybe more than that, that bill would not be passed without any need for reconsideration. Within the veto power, the president can refuse to assent any bill excluding the money bill. So that means that president has a lot of veto power. That is why this power is also known as pocket veto. And that has been, the uses of this power has been seen in the 1986 when there was a passage like bill had to be passed, the Indian Post Act had to be passed, but the then president 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 used this power of refusing to assent that bill. So that means there was no time limit, so he did not send it back to the Council of Ministers and was within him for all over his term of office. And third uses is of more of a political circumstances. As you know that there is elections for Lok Sabha, and the party that has a majority in Lok Sabha, that is the party with the majority support with the Lok Sabha members, and their leader is chosen as the Prime Minister. But what, imagine if there is no political party with the majority in the Lok Sabha, what would happen? Like, whom can we choose as the Prime Minister? And we do know that there are coalitions in our country. But even if there is no coalition which has won that elections, then what would happen? Then at that time president acts as a powerful person. What happens that if suppose there are many parties who are claiming that we are having the majority, we are having this or that, but at that time president would see that whether a leader, like which leader has more majority and is the most suitable candidate for becoming the Prime Minister of our country. So at that time the president would choose a leader as the Prime Minister of the country, seeing all his experience, work experience, his nature, and the suitability for becoming the Prime Minister, and the favorability by the people of members of the Lok Sabha. So that means that at that political circumstances, because you know what, that from 1989 to 1998, between these years, what happened that a lot of political circumstances were seen, and what happened that there had been not a single party which won the elections. At that time the president used their powers, and that happens in some of other cases as well. So that means the president is having these powers. Besides that, what happened that the president has the right to be informed of all the related matters of the country. That means that if any mission has to be taken place, all the works done by the Council of Ministers have to be reported to the president, and president can show his views, write his views, messages to the Council of Ministers. So that means that everything happening in the country by the Prime Minister or the Council of Ministers has to be reported or has to be informed to the president. President has a right to be known of all the matters. Nothing should be kept confidential from him. So that means that the president, even acting as a formal head of the state, has some discretionary powers, but still he or she is the formal head of the state and acts as the ceremonial head of the state. So then what is the use of having president in our country? Can it be that we are not having any president and just having the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers? No, it can't be, because president is needed in our country. First of all, we need someone to represent our country who acts as a formal head of the state. Besides that, in political circumstances, we need a president who can act as a powerful leader, appointing the Prime Minister of our country. And what happens that if there are Lok Sabha elections, those things, there should be a person who acts as an powerful person, like a powerful head, and is having the power to resolve the matters of the Lok Sabha, of the Parliament, and at the same time is on a permanent basis. You know that the president is chosen for 5 years in our country and can never be you could say suspended from his office until and unless an impeachment for the constitution, an impeachment of the constitution, and that too shall be passed by the 2/3 of the members of the parliament. So that means that we can say that there is a lot of symbolism, lot of you could say that some powers have been given to the President of India, and that is the constitutional position of the President of of India. Now, besides president, there is one very important figure, that is the vice president of India. Now, as you know that even in schools or colleges, we have the monitor and vice monitor. We have the leader and vice leader, vice captain. So we have vice people as well, and in government as well, we have the vice president. Now, this person can act as a president in case the president has resigned or that vacancy or some other cases have been filed there. So if the president's seat is vacant, so if there is vacancy for the president's office, then the vice president can act as a president in a very temporary manner until the new president is elected. The term of office for the vice president is of 5 years and is indirectly elected by the people. The only difference from his election than the president's election is that there is only the members of the parliament. There is no state legislative assembly members in the election of the vice president. The vice president acts as an ex officio chairman of the Rajya Sabha and works in that in that department. Vice president acts after the president. You do not add, we have captain and vice captain. So in a similar manner, president and vice president. Vice president can act in a very powerful manner as well if there is vacancy for the president. And after all, behind president there are vice presidents. Then the next topic that comes here is Prime Minister and Council of Ministers. So Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. Now you know what, that no discussion in government or politics in India can take place without mentioning one office, that is of course the Prime Minister. You have seen in news that there are a lot of mentionings about the Prime Minister, even in newspapers. Any article you take about politics, you would find his or her name. Then why this position? Prime Minister becomes very important in our country. Let us discuss that too. We have already seen that President is controlled or is advised by the Council of Ministers, which is headed by the Prime Minister. That means indirectly Prime Minister is the one who is advising the President, and it becomes very important because the Prime Minister is the overall head of the government in our country, most important functionary in the government of our country. What's more is that the Prime Minister needs to have the majority in the Parliament, and if the majority in the Parliament or the Lok Sabha, the House of People, is lost, then the Prime Minister is binded to resign from his or her own office, that is the position of the Prime Minister. So that means the majority of the people of Lok Sabha becomes very important for the Prime Minister, for the position or the office of Prime Minister. You do know that the elections for Prime Minister are held every 5 years in our country. So the term of office would be of 5 years. Then after, we see that Prime Minister is the head of the Council of Ministers, which is responsible for a lot of functions. After the Prime Minister is elected, then the Council of Ministers would be appointed by the Prime Minister and would be the different ministries, portfolios would be allocated to different ministers. What would happen that seeing the seniority, seeing the work experience, seeing the suitability, different leaders would be chosen as the cabinet ministers by the Prime Minister. So that means that Prime Minister is the one who chooses all the cabinet ministers and the Council of Ministers in our country. Now what's more, that there is one other thing, that what would be the size of Council of Ministers? Is it that for coalition, for the purpose of making coalitions, the Council of Ministers would be so long? It can't be like that. You know what, that before 2003 there was no size limit of the Council of Ministers. So mostly what would happen in the central government and in the state governments as well, that the different people, different leaders of the coalitions would be promised of granting some ministries to them after they form allies with some big parties. So that means, because there was no size limit of the Council of Ministers, so there could be as many ministers as you want. But after the 91st Amendment Act of 2003, this was changed. Now only 15% of the total member of House of the People would be chosen as the Council of Ministers, in the Council of Ministers by the Prime Minister, and mostly they are from the ruling party. that has won the elections with the majority support in the Lok Sabha. So that means that there is a size limit of the Council of Ministers as well. Then this Council of Ministers does all the ministry work in our country, different ministry, like in the states as well, in the central government as well. In state too, we have the same type of central executive that happens there. Same happens in the state governments as well. The only difference that we don't have presidents in the state governments. Instead, we have the governor of the state who is chosen by the president on the advice of Council of Ministers. So in state too, we have the governor, the chief minister, who chooses all the ministers in our state. So that means the same thing is happening both in the state level and the union level. Then after talking about the prime minister, we do see that prime minister enjoys a preeminent place in our country, in the government of our country. Why is it so? Because prime minister has a lot of power, access to media, projection as a national leader during foreign summitries or foreign visits, then projection as many you could say portraits during the election campaigns. Then after, the command of Lok Sabha is within him. Then the command of bureaucracy, that is administrative machinery, is also under the prime minister of our country. So we can say that the prime minister of India holds a lot of power. In India, we see that there is the Council of Ministers have a sense of collective responsibility, that is, they are bound by the collective responsibility. So if there is a Council of Ministers and the Lok Sabha has no confidence in one of its ministries, then all the Council of Ministers, the whole Council of Ministers has to be resigned, has to be dissolved, because one ministry has been lost confidence by the Lok Sabha. So that means that collective responsibility in this sense here means that if one ministry has been seen with no confidence by the Lok Sabha, then the overall Council of Ministers has to be dissolved. And also, if there is a policy decided by whole Council of Ministers but one ministry is not satisfied with it, then he or she either has to resign or has to follow that decision or policy. So that means that collective responsibility, collective belonging in the Council of Ministers, that all the Council of Ministers are responsible for all the things happening among them, and they have to inform, the information about their work has to be given to the president by the prime minister. So the prime minister has to act like a wall or kind of link between the president and the Council of Ministers. That is why Pandit Nehru, the first prime minister of our country, made the prime minister, set the prime minister as a linchpin of the government. So that means that prime minister holds a lot of power in our country. We have also seen that the election for the prime minister is a direct election by the people. It's not like indirect election, it is a direct election, as we have seen in the last chapter. And the prime minister holds a lot of power, and we see that a lot of unaccessible power have been given to him. But that is the only case where we find some things different, the ideal powers of the prime minister are very much, but how much the prime minister is using his or her power depends on the person. Because since 1989 we have seen a lot of coalitions government in India. What has happened that if there is a complete majority of a single party in our country, then there is no question about the uses of power by the prime minister. But since 1989 we have seen a lot of coalitions in our country. Then what happens that in coalition, different parties, pre-post as well as post-poll, come together as alliance, form allies, and contest in elections together. Then that means that even after that coalition government, coalition party has been elected by the people, then all the decisions are negotiated. That means that, let me tell you in a brief manner, that if there is a coalition party that has won the elections, then what would happen? First would be that there would be more increased uses of discretionary power by the president, as choosing the prime minister would be difficult. Secondly, there would be more and more negotiations between the prime minister and the leaders of the coalition, different parties like allies parties. So consultation would be more between the prime minister and different leaders of the coalition. Third, there would be variations in the prerogatives of the prime minister. That means that like appointment of different ministers, their portfolios would be different, as they have to be consulted with the leaders of the allied parties. That prime minister is bound to do so because they have formed an alliance. Fourth, even the laws and bills have to be passed with negotiations and compromises from the leaders of the allied parties. So that means here the prime minister is not acting as the head of the government. Instead, he or she is acting as the head of the coalition party or as a negotiator in the coalition party. So that means that there can be different impacts on the power uses of the prime minister due to the coalition boundings. So that is why this becomes harmful in our country, because the ideal power of the prime minister are vast in our country, but whether they are used in reality or not remains unknown, and that is why it needs to be uplifted by the people, because we need to know that what is happening in our country. So that would be overall about the prime minister and the Council of Ministers, which is headed by the Prime Minister in our country. Now the next topic that we have got here is permanent executive bureaucracy. So permanent executive bureaucracy. Now the executive organ of the government in our country includes the ministers, the prime ministers and the president, and a very large complex organization, bureaucracy. This bureaucracy is also known as the administrative machinery, and to distinguish it between the military services and these services, we have named it as the civil services. So basically civil services are those services provided by the government of India to people who work as the actual implementers of all those policies adopted by the legislature to day-to-day functioning of the people, and they are supervised by the government, like legislature, it could be state government as well as central governments. So these are the people, like they also form the executive in our country, and they are on a permanent basis. That is, they are not elected by the people, but they have come on the basis of their merits by clearing some exams, or it could be on the basis of their merits. In India, you know what would happen, that the constitution makers were aware that we need someone neutral, because these people, administrative machinery, has to be neutral. No such officer can take part in any formation of policies. Like if there is a bill that has to be passed, so no opinion can be his or her on that matter. That officer has to be neutral. So administrative machinery has to be neutral and has to help in the formulation of laws, has to help the ministers in the formulation of bills and laws. So what would happen, that suppose if there was a government, now the next Lok Sabha has come up, like the earlier one has been dissolved, the next one has come up, new government has been formed in our country, and they are eradicating all the policies made by the previous government and are making their own policies. So they can opt for the administrative machinery to work for them in the formation of that policy, and these people, administrative officers, faithfully and efficiently have to help them without any their own opinions, because they have to be neutral. They are not some politicians, but they are the actual permanent executive based on their own merits. So the Indian constitution makers wanted someone non-partisan people and neutral people to be in our country as a part of executive. That is why they made provisions for the administrative machinery, and that is also civil services. And for that purpose, for the central level, we have the Union Public Service Commission, or the UPSC, for choosing the civil servants on a central manner. And for states as well, we have the PCS, like State Public Commissions, state service commissions, which are for the choosing of all those, appointment of all those administrative machinery or administrative officers in states particularly. In India, we have different civil servants, we have different bureaucrats that is working under the UPSC, they have been chosen by the UPSC, or it could be PCS, it could be local government people, there could be managerial staff, technical staffs, and other people. They all are forming the administrative machinery of our country, and that is why they become very important in our country, because they are also holding a very large part in the executive and are actually connected by the people. In districts, in states, in country level, we do have these people according to their positions, their roles in our government. So they too are forming the executive of our country. Now there can be some classification of these services as well. So classification of civil services can be of three types. First one are the all India services, like the Indian Administrative Service and the Indian Police Service, which have been chosen by the UPSC. Second one could be central government central services, which include the Indian Foreign Service, Indian Forest Service. These are some of the chosen central services. Then third could be the state services. Now these have been chosen by the state particularly, that includes sale tax officers and some other officers. So that means there can be three type classifications of the civil services. Now besides that, let us talk about the Indian Administrative Service. Now you do know that in district we have a district collector, and that is the highest person, highest government office holder in a district, most powerful office holder in a district level. That is a collector of a district, and that person is also an IAS officer, that is Indian Administrative Service. He or she is working for the Indian Administrative Service. Similarly, we have the Indian police system as well in different districts, in different states. We have a lot of all India service people in different states who are supervised by the state governments, but disciplinary action can be taken against them only by the state central government, not by the state government. State government, they are working in the states but are supervised by the central government, but are controlled by the central government. Any action can be taken against them only by the central government, and they can only be suspended by a very complete you could say complete jurisdiction, complete research, complete investigation by a judge of the Supreme Court. That has been made a provision in our country. So suspension of these people can only be taken place by a complete investigation by a judge of the Supreme Court. And we have this also shows some kind of federalism in our country that we'll discuss later in later chapters of this book, because they are working for the state government, they are working in a state, administrative officers are working in a state, but they have been controlled by the central government. So that means that there is a sense of federalism in our country. We'll discuss about that in the later chapters of this book as well. Now what is there in our country, that there have been a lot of problems with the administrative officers. Many people say that they are not an actual representation of the people, that is, they are not directly connected by the people to the people, because some people are very afraid of these people, they hold a lot of power, some can't approach them because of their position. But you have to see that in our country there have been many wrong provisions as well. A very efficient government is needed to control these bureaucrats, but at the same time we are seeing a lot of political interference in their duties as well. They are being used as a political tool by these politicians. What happens that they are not performing their duties to the political interference that much, so they can't just perform their duties. Another thing is that now it has been seen that they are not expressing themselves that much, and that is why it is seen that with the enactment of the Right to Information Act, some changes would be seen. So that is the case of bureaucrats in our country. They are the permanent executive in our country. That is, they are on the basis of their own merit. You know what the major difference between the political executive and the permanent executive is of the educational qualification. That is, the political executive are elected by the people. That means they do not need to have any kind of educational qualification. They could be some degree holders, they could be some educated, like illiterate people, but the permanent executive need to have some merits, like they are educationally qualified. Only then they can become the permanent executive. Now the last topic of this chapter, that is of course the conclusion of this chapter. Now what do we conclude from this chapter? Basically we can conclude from this chapter that the modern executive is a very complex kind of organization, organ of the government, and is holding the most power in our country. We have seen the role of president, the prime minister, and there's one more thing with prime minister. You know what, that prime minister holds the most important powers in the government of our country, most important functionary of the government. With that can be seen with the relationship between the council of ministers and the prime minister. You know what, that when a prime minister is resigning, or some kind of death vacancies have been there, then the whole council of ministers have to be dissolved. But if a minister has resigned, or some kind of vacancy is there, then it is just a mere ministerial vacancy. It won't be that the prime minister would be leaving his or her own job. No, that won't be the case, because the relationship is so that the prime minister is holding more power than the council of ministers. That is why that person, the prime minister, is the head of the council of ministers. In this chapter we have seen the political executive as well as the permanent executive, different types of executive, presidential system, semi-presidential system, and the parliamentary system. And we see that for India we have chosen the best option of the parliamentary executive, and we see that executive is the most needed in our country. It is controlled by the legislature and is controlling the legislature as well, because it is the most powerful, so it needs supervision as well, routinely supervision as well. So that would be the conclusion of this chapter, that we have the executive in our country with a various kind of supervision by the legislature, and the executive is holding the most powers in the country. That would be the conclusion of this chapter. So in this chapter I have covered all the topics and subtopics of this chapter, which are very important for your class exams as well, and if you're preparing for the competitives, then also it becomes very important. So that is all we have covered in this chapter, and that's all for it. I'll be covering the next chapters of this book in the further upcoming videos. So stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Thank you very much.